Craig Wing is an associate of the Tarisha Center. And we've been engaging for quite some time, actually dating back to his PhD years, to the process undertaken over the last year or more, writing his book, his award-winning book, which is now available as exclusive books. You can send 5% now. But also having conversations about the very exciting data that's coming out of this project that we'll be talking about today. So I think one of the ideas has been, and I think including for those who are listening to this later, that it's useful to begin exposing this to people who might have an interest to know what the project is and the kind of data that's coming out. But one of the really exciting things is also to see what questions people begin wanting to ask of the data. And so I guess the combination of the work we're doing through Tarisha and thinking about digital governance, but also through partnerships like Mind and this sort of multidisciplinary network across the campus and the Busy Sciences program, with a whole bunch of master's and PhD students that often are either looking for new research questions or potentially could be stimulated into some research interest. And so this is in a way the first time that we're doing something like this. So it's really a show and tell, saying, look, hey, I've got this data and I've been doing this project. What might research interests be? So we're really looking forward to seeing, I guess, just whatever questions might come up for anybody. In particular, I guess we are looking forward to seeing if anybody actually develops, gets stimulated with some research interests that might pick up on the kinds of data that's coming out of Craig's project. I didn't plan a detailed biographical intro of Craig Wing, but I think for many of us who are in the futures and foresight space in South Africa and internationally, he's a very well-known futurist, speaks widely, particularly in corporate. I have some corporate friends. He's one of them. But in the corporate world, but also the public sector world, actually. So I think very well known for his content in that space. He's also known very well in the innovation space in South Africa, dating back to the Innovation Hub. I see everybody. I was about to say, I see all of the people high-fiving him when he walks through, when it's a week or any of these spaces, UJ. So he's not a stranger, I think, to many people who are also in the innovation space. But I think without further ado, let's get into what Craig's prepared for us and book signings later for anybody who's got a copy. Over to you.
Thanks, Prof. Katie. I appreciate it. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I am, it's coming home for me. I am a Witsy undergrad and after my engineering here. Even though some would say to me, I've gone to the other university down the road for my PhD, which is true. But I am still a Witsy, and as mentioned by Gaethje, perhaps my first foray outside of the studies was at Wits Commercial Enterprise, helping students at that stage, engineering science, try to commercialize their businesses, and maybe there's something over here as well. I've lectured at Wits a few times here, public policy, and a couple of other places as well. But as Gaethje mentioned, a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is an extension of the PhD. And the PhD, which I'll explain shortly, has led to the development of a curriculum database. I'm going to go a little further. But primarily what we're trying to do over here is we're trying to say, well, let's have an exploration around what potentially could we do around this database, which I'll speak to you about shortly, and how do we use it to measure stuff? Now, I use it in a very non-academic context because I think it's important also to say this is how practitioners might be thinking about these kinds of questions. Okay? So this is not new things, basic statement, positioning statement, shall we say. The challenge we know is several, it's multiplicitous, but in the context of Tarisha, we know that there's a cross of governments for a while. We're having a conversation earlier around the big area, the topical area, obviously, is governments of AI or governments in AI. And that expands further beyond just artificial intelligence, this whole area of fourth industrial revolution technologies, whatever that might mean. Whether that's quantum, whether that's old school digitalization, IoT, so on and so forth. And so when you look at the questions around governance, questions become very problematic, but certainly they are questions around saying, how do we adapt to certain pieces? How do we adapt to a digital age? And the question is, how do we do that? Right? So when we think about them, here's a couple of questions that I've thought in the context of this conversation. Governance models must adapt to digital age, but how? My PhD was actually around thinking about the future space, and specifically for this topic of this conversation, how do you do governance and how can you think about governance in an age where things are moving very quickly, when there is no precedence, when there is no frameworks, when we have an approach where it's very bifurcated and it might be different from different places, different pockets in the AI is moving very quickly in places like Singapore, maybe UAE, but in Africa, certainly there's a lack and certainly a lagging behind. Is there a link between governance model and its actual resilience and rigidity, i.e. can we use governance as a driver for other things that certainly in the corporate space, let me say, has more quantifiable metrics. So it doesn't drive profitability, it doesn't drive revenue, it doesn't drive company culture, for argument's sake. And as a result, which how do we move from a cost center, shall we say, governance as being a lagging factor, something that actually drives business. And perhaps more importantly, and specifically for this context, this conversation, how do we move into the empirical analysis? So for Tyresha, much like all of us on this call, we know that governance is important, but how important? Can you rate it? Can you measure it? Can you do all those different things? And therein lies the question, and a very smart person, much smarter than me, said this: measure what can be measured and make measure what can be measured. And this again ties with the same principle, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have around governance, even digital governance. How do you measure this thing called digital governance? Now, obviously, we can debate and say, what is the definition of it and how do you stop there? But fundamentally, my hope is I can present you something that says, how do we measure things a little bit better? So what's the PhD? Well, this is really what it was. As Prof. Getju mentioned, it was really in the future space. And fundamentally, the research question I was trying to answer in layperson's terms was, what do companies do to be successful in the future? That's the layperson term, right? So it was a mixed method analysis, quant and qual. But the qualitative part was really around interviewing 14 executives in South Africa across different industries, finance, insurance, retail, all different kinds of things, and basically asking them through an interview type thing, what have you learned through following the project backcasting? For those of you who don't know what backcasting is, it's a methodology, shall we say, in futures thinking, where as opposed to today forecasting the future, it's about saying, how do you think about a point in the future and work backwards from there? So as a general thought philosophy, irrespective of the actual tool that's used, whether it was scenarios, science fictioning, expert review, patent analysis, whatever the case may be, what have you learned? And out of that pops 25 different attributes, as you can see around the circumference of this Venn diagram. The three areas that then emerge out of these 25 factors are leadership, organization, landscape. I won't go through this, but what I do want you to note over there is that it formed the basis of three pillars, fundamentally: leadership, organization, landscape. And out of that, using a bit of statistical analysis, we can determine what I've called future fitness. And again, one of the ambitions of Tyresha is how do you make Africa more future ready, future proof, whatever your phrase might be. But basically, how do you make Africa more resilient and ready for the future? What you will notice, though, on the right-hand side, under the function, or rather under the sub-bucket of organization, is two that have been highlighted, there being technology and codification in the past. Technology, as per the definition of the PhD, was within the angle of framing of 4R technology. But broadly speaking, it could be technology. But we use the framing because that's obviously a topical area. But again, this isn't about being specifics, it's about finding what emerged out of this research. The second thing over there, you'll see codification of the past, and the definition of that is actually governance. It's actually how you have got the prerequisite governance structures and how you think about it. So those are just two examples of data points we've collected. So what does this data set actually look like? Well, first of all, we took this data set that we showed right now. So these factors over here, I've created a SaaS tool. You might have seen in previous slides, you'll see a tool called WhatTheForesight, which is a SaaS tool that I was created in a new sentiment analysis. Basically, it's a survey that goes out to an audience in a corporate space, for argument's sake, with all the employees. It might be a management team, it might be graduates, it might be marketing, or whatever the case may be. And from there, they gauge and they say, where are we rated on a scale between 1 and 10 today on these questions, and where do we want to be in the future? So that's the data, that's how we apply this data and information. That then gives us essentially a gap analysis around the perception of today and where we want to be in the future, which is typically a 5-year horizon. Okay. There's a number of demographic data that's collected as well. So that forms the basis for the acquisition of this data set. What then is this data set? So we've been running this now. So I've been running this SaaS tool for about a year and a half, and I'm very pleased to say that this is the data that's come through. So there's over 50,000 data points. There's 550 responses. And there's 25 attributes, including governance and technology stores. So apologies for the spacing over there. It's not reading greatly. But out of the data, the survey that comes through is, in addition to the 25 attributes asked twice, i.e., today and tomorrow, 25 times 2. There's also an additional 37 data points that were collected, which include demographic data points. So things like inner South African context, also just in general, things like what race are you, age, tenure, department, and so on and so forth. There's also a little bit of metadata as well, which allows us to understand what's coming through. And as a result of which we can see that it's now been used by about 150 plus organizations on campus, startups, enterprises, and these are big multinationals, some of them local, and a couple of non-profits as well as some qualitative comments. So that's the data set that's been collected across the board over time. This is an example of what I think might be really interesting. One of the questions sustainability, which is again, think about it as an allergic example around governance. So we know it's an important thing, but if you can't measure it, so what importance does it have? So through a bit of beta analysis and p-value analysis over here, this was about understanding what drives sustainability. So we took the same data set, and I'm either unashamedly or shamedly so, depending on how you look at this next point. I used a GPT to get some of these correlations. The point is it shows the direction that we go, right? So what this shows over here is I presented at a corporate client 2 weeks ago. And one of the questions that was asked there was, how important is sustainability and climate change? Specifically when we look at corporate landscape. And what we find over here is there's a significant correlation. And again, this is correlation, not causation, but we don't know which direction it goes because of the data. But what we do know is there's a correlation between sustainability and the agility and entrepreneurial mindset of the organization, which is really interesting. So if we are
using that to actually sell millions of euros of software.
Yes,
you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly right. Now the question is how do we come to this point now, and how do we have data behind it? Like old Galileo said, let's measure the stuff. So I'll give you another example. The second one is really interesting. Right? So a corporate that's, let's say, driven only by profit and say, well, this climate change sustainability thing, it's a cost center. It doesn't mean anything to us. Why should we do this? Well, there's an answer right there. Marketplace disruption correlation coefficient of 1.5 billion. Huge, gigantic. Right? So what that means in layperson terms is for every 1 point that drives sustainability, there's also a correlation on the marketplace disruption. Yeah, Prof. G.
No, I don't know if you mind if we interrupt you, the question for clarity.
Yeah.
So how do you do the correlation? So does that mean the question about sustainability focus is one of the questions that's already there? That's why you're able to do the correlation?
That's correct.
So you can only do it for questions that have been...
Correct. Okay. So of the 25 that we have over here, and again, I can show you a different set of questions. And this is where it becomes really interesting for a data set of this size. We can essentially pivot around any one of these things, right? So you'll probably see where we've got over there.
So under one of these, maybe equals.
Yeah, it should be under landscape. Under landscape would be sustainability. It would be there. That was actually 25th was added to that one. Okay. But we can also start looking at other things. So top right hand side, if you look there for argument's sake, under technology, 2 underneath it's culture. There's another prime example. Right? So we say things like culture is important. Yeah. Well, how important is culture? I don't know. It's really important. But how do we know it actually contributes to the bottom line? So we could find a correlation analysis. We could run a correlation analysis like we do right now, a beta analysis between culture, and go to on the green box on the bottom left-hand corner, see profit and shareholder value. Mm-hmm. Now you could see is a correlation between the culture, is getting better, and profit and shareholder value. We could do some other stuff. We could say, well, let's understand the disruption, i.e. how prepared are we for disruption, and let's say around alignment of IT. So this is where this becomes really powerful across the board. So that's the general thesis of what we have. And again, this over here was an example of that, where we're theoretically, we've now got data to say that. And again, just by looking at those correlation coefficients over there, we can see we now have an ability to tell a story that's compelling around a sustainability question, shall we say, climate change. Okay. Again, colleagues online, if you've got any questions, please do throw them into the chat as well. And I can answer them as we go through and in the room as well. If not, I'm going to proceed with this. So why is it important? Well, again, I was a little bit cheeky, but I took a snapshot of the Irish institution, right? And the big thing over here is how do we do this? How do we have high impact Irish research? Now, I think, and again, and I stand to be corrected, this area of governance is one where we need data. We need numbers, and specifically within the remit of Tarisha, how do we then allow this to actual research itself and actual outcomes? My hope is this could drive maybe a conversation, maybe not even an output, But a conversation, say, how do you measure governance, whether it's governance plain vanilla or governance digital? When you have a look at those two factors together, and maybe even overall the way that I've determined your propensity to succeed in the future or around future fitness. So is there a closer correlation between digital and that? Future stuff around team, or we can put it around any one of those 87 data points. So that's the power of this. So to come to this point over here, get you is what are some potential research questions, potential errors. I just took the liberty of throwing together a few over here, right? And you'll see the marketing hat come over here, future fitness genome, just because it sounds cool, okay? But fundamentally, when we have a look at those 25 factors over there, bearing in mind it falls into leadership organization landscape, and now that we have got a 50,000 point database, 500 odd respondees, can we actually find out what drives that the most? Okay, so we can say, when we can then say, we've got published research to say, in terms of future fitness, while I might have done the scoring to say, and I'd bet you a little quicker up here, on the bottom side, you may be able to see this on the bottom over here. You'll see that leadership, this weighting over here. Essentially what this shows is when we normalize, or rather when I normalize the research around how many times respondees spoke about the organization, i.e. the orange stuff, when we do the codification, bearing in mind this 25. So when you were to do, if you were to do a statistical analysis, you'd say in the course of an hour over the time frame, 125, 4%, that's how long you should be speaking about each one of these elements, bearing in mind it's 25. What actually happens is leadership is spoken about 50% more than what we think. So that's how I managed to get these ratings. What does that mean in English? In English, it means when you normalize it around organization, the orange stuff over there, leadership seems to have an outsourced effect of 50%. Okay? As much as that, right? So that's what came through my research. But even more interesting is landscape, the green stuff is 10% more than organization. Again, in layman terms and corporate terms, what does it mean? It means most organizations focus on the orange stuff, the business model, the operations, the technology, metrics, all that kind of stuff. But what my research shows, and again, I'm happy for other people to come up with different numbers, my research shows the blue stuff counts 50% more. So even though I can show that it's 50% more the blue stuff over the orange stuff, the question is within those buckets, what drives more of that? And so that's the question over there. Perhaps within the leadership bucket, its vision and values actually drives more than the other four factors, right? Perhaps when you have a look at organization, the thing that counts the least is metrics. I don't know. Maybe it's actually the business model itself. I don't know. But potentially now we've got some data to show this. You can see already the impact potential of this is huge, whether from a business point of view, whether from a modeling point of view, whether here at the business school, what does it mean when you say we have to create businesses? Well, sure, but what's the stack rank priority around? So that's potential stream over there. Another one is to say, well, can we fingerprint these things? So can we say, when we have a look at this entire database of 500 odd respondees, 150 organizations, can we now start to cluster them? And can we start saying, well, yes, we can find within this, there's some kind of statistically relevant pieces. So there's startups that have run this that are ABCD. So think about it as an analogy. You might have done a Myers-Briggs type thing, an integrated thing. Can we find the equivalents of IFMPs, IJ, whatever the case may be? Or you find your color ones. Can you find blue organizations, red ones, or so forth, right? And again, this helps us break out. Within the context of digital governance, perhaps we even say, what is the staging pathway? So by and large, we all start at, I don't know, we can work on that with the framing over here and the verbiage, but essentially we all start at level 0. To get to level 1, we need to have A, B, C, D of these 25 factors. We need to have 3 of these in place. To get to the next level, we have to have 8 of these in place. To get to the top tier, the top quartile, you have to have 15 of the 25 at some number. Right? So that again starts to help us score, and potentially even then that becomes really interesting, colleagues, is can we start creating a scoreboard of this, which I know is something we've spoken about before, right? So we can then take the same research, roll it out to partners, corporates, clients, non-profits, etc., and say, well, now we can create a scoreboard around your digital governance or any one of those 25 factors that we can put upon. Okay, we can start doing stuff around perception. So what are some of the themes that come through? Is there anything that's really interesting that comes across? So for organizations that may have, I don't know, more employees between the age of 20 and 30, what's the propensity for them to focus on A versus 50 to 60? In the South African context, again, is a company that has majority ex-populace more likely to focus around this versus another populace? Do we have more propensity to have a look at governance by teams? So is there more teams that look at governance as a real thing from strategy? Well, we hope so, but perhaps the data doesn't show that. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's not even considered except for executives. So we can start to slice this and say what drives that and what's the sentiment around it. And then finally, again, aligned with also the verbiage on Tarisha's website and some of the work that I've heard from other researchers in this group and in the room right now, this whole question around innovation and governance. Is there a connection? Is there correlation? We suspect it is, but is there? I don't know. And if that's the case, can we perhaps even then use this as a baseline, as a meta thing to then study and say, well, if there is, and again, I'm going to make this number up here, let's assume there's a correlation factor of 0.7 for argument's sake. It's a high number, right? Perhaps then we can go and say, what does innovation then mean in the context of this? So it gives us a lens to say, let's double click on what innovation might mean in the context of governance, and again, all other. So there's a couple of streams that are proposed over there. Here's just a bit of marketing spiel over here, just to find out if you'd be interested. But potentially, you can read through this. I'm not going to go through this in live, but basically, the long and short of it is I believe there might be a huge opportunity over here to use the 50,000 data points database to drive some really interesting research to get the forefront of an emerging space, whether it's AI or technology in general. And again, we could find a way that makes sense. So I've got a couple of proposed next steps over here, just for the sake of it. Obviously, part of this is they have to look at ownership structures and who owns what. Obviously, from my side, I'm happy to determine use case for Tarisha and maybe Wits in general. Obviously, I'll have to be willing to craft what the agreement looks like, but the use case of a commercial database to understand what it looks like. And the nice thing is this is a growing database. So because this is part of my commercial work, the database should grow and it should allow us to have a longer-term impact. And maybe this also allows us as Tarisha to go back to some of our current partners, clients, et cetera, and say, well, now we have this framework and we've got some kind of recipe. How do you fit into that recipe? Again, that then means there might be some future opportunities, maybe commercial or otherwise. But fundamentally, I think the next step is to find a way to say, is there of interest, whether with the institution directly, whether with some of the researchers, postgrads, whether you do doctorate, masters, whatever. And that's what I have for now. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Happy to take some questions. And also, by all means, also, please, colleagues, if you want to push back and say you don't understand this, or even perhaps you might say, well, have you thought about this or a different angle? I'm happy to take that feedback as well.
Different skill model.
Different skill model. I'm definitely happy. Don't use ChatGPT. Please go use Gemini.
Okay, great. Are you sharing? Okay, I think thank you so much for that, Craig, and I'm sure there's some questions coming up. I already have one or two myself, but I think what's really interesting is just to see what's coming up for people, either by way of wanting to understand a little bit better the data that's there, or what kinds of ideas are already popping up for people about how this could be used in research, maybe in teaching, and certainly perhaps around the possibility of partnerships and student projects, as Craig has already began to indicate. So just opening up the floor. For those who are online, please raise a hand and then we'll be able to attend to you and to bring you in. You're also welcome to use the chat. I think we have access to that. But yeah, I'm hoping that people will begin to engage. Let me maybe lead while we're waiting for hands to come up. Oh, is this the...
Yeah, just really quickly, just so you can see, we'll obviously have to scrub this because I can't give personal information.
Sure.
But the important thing is if you just have a look at the headers, I think that's just to do that. The important thing over here is have a look at the headers, and I'll make this a lot bigger, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at. So just try to normalize this over here. Okay, so what you'll see, this is just some of the data that's collected, right? So we've got name of the company, we've got sector. So what sectors, organization, size of the business, age of business. Some of them have not been added in because obviously I've grown this tool as we've gone through. But this is to give you an idea of the data acquisition. So primary market is something we're doing right now. That would be, for argument's sake, rural and urban. A huge differentiator. It's something I think is really important in from context. Gender, race, age range, department, tenure, highest education level. A future fitness score, which is the one that we calculate. And then all of these from O onwards is then questions of stuff like what is the leadership score today, your perception today on a rating of 0 to 10, and future. That's why you'll see that replicate. So leadership, organization, and then there's some qualitative questions over there, and so on and so forth. Right? I just want to go to the very end just to show you some metadata. So apologies, colleagues over here. And you can see there. So that's for argument's sake, those are the questions that come through. But the point is, it is a data set that is both growing but very comprehensive. As mentioned before, there's 87 data points that are collected per survey. So stop sharing that. Just to give you an idea of the kind of data that we collect. Sorry, did you?
No, perfect. So again, just as we wait for questions, I have maybe just a few, maybe more on the level of the method and how it comes to be before diving into the data itself. What could you give us an example? Because how many firms you've done? Over 150 firms.
Yeah.
Could you give us an idea of what does it look like for a firm to answer this survey? Just to get a sense of where the data is actually coming from in the sense of who within firms, or is it different for every firm? Is it possible that in some firms it's their top management team was a part of a process, but in another firm it's a cross section of employees?
Yeah. Yes, cool. So it's first of all in terms of the data acquisition, in terms of how the questions get asked, or rather how the data gets collected. This might be useful to show. I'm trying to see if I can get a sample of this. Questions in terms of where they come through. Okay, I'll find that as we go through this. In terms of how it's currently being done, is data gets collected from as they see fit. So it's gone all the way from, for a start, for argument's sake, with the entire organization. I'm working with an entrepreneurship organization which gave me access to 20 of their members. So it's a cohort type thing. There was only executive management. There's been another organization that did a whole bunch of that works with insurers, the reinsurers, and that was also a select part of the exco team. There's a multinational consulting company overseas that I've done this work with. It's part of the L&D. So they said they're hyper focused on middle to senior management, on direct staff, the perception of those organizations. So it varies across the board. But like all data things, we want to have the full organization. That's obviously not possible at certain times.
And the international ones, are they working in South Africa?
No, not necessarily. In fact, the current, the international ones they have a presence in South Africa, but it's not the international department. It's not global.
Okay. So if hypothetically one was wanting to ask research questions about South Africa, you'd need to actually limit it to just South Africa because you've got South Africa data.
Yes. So what we do is in the data set post. So once you have the Excel, we have to demarcate it and add in. There is actually in the action now, I think about it, part of the demographic data that's collected when you do the thing is actually I will know which country. So it's already pre-categorized on which country. So when you register, you choose which country you're from.
Yeah, and then the other thing I was wondering was, so this is applied, I think I saw one of your slides, I have to know as well, that it's mainly corporates, but they're big, small, and maybe some NGOs? That's
correct, yeah. So it's been used across the board. I've used it for, so corporates is the easiest angle, and all the way from multinationals to less multinational, big companies, not less. A couple of startups have used it, and it's actually an interesting use case that's emerging out of here, which is a adaptation of the tool right now is being used for entrepreneurs, both in terms of single and co-founders, and up to 3. Even though you don't get curative data, what that allows you to do is for co-founders to understand how much alignment there may be. So when you do start business, the 2 of us want to start business. We say, hey, we want to start this business, but we want to make sure we do good. This isn't just about making money. This is about doing good in the world today. Great, so we both agree on that. The problem is we might have different definition of what it means. So now we can score it. Right? So as I'm rebuilding this right now, for argument's sake, the current commercial model for corporates is profit making. For the non-profits, it'll be around what impact we're making. The point that I'm making is in this example we're going right now, yes, we want to make money, but we want to do good for the world. your idea of making money might be a 4 out of 10, I'm an 8 out of 10. So really we see some dissonance that we might have thought is implicit, but it's not explicitly verbal, right? And that becomes a problem when you start. So that's an iteration I make across the board there with my profits. Entrepreneurs, startups has been all out across the board here.
Do you see a possibility of it being done with public sector organizations? And if it did, would the initial assumptions or questions have to change because it did start with corporate leadership? So I was just wondering.
So that would probably be more aligned to non-profits. So it probably wouldn't be around profit making, it'd be around impact, around making a difference in society good. We've shown that way. I wouldn't change the questions per se, and a couple of folks said, can we add this question, can we do that? My answer has been no, because it changes the integrity of research, and then your weightings change, and a whole bunch of other problems became up. That, however, doesn't stop us to say, let's assume for argument's sake that we do the survey, and one that comes up very strongly is, again, it's perception today and the future. Let's assume for argument's sake innovation is 4 today, and it's 9 in the future. It doesn't stop, say, the client go back and say, well, what does it mean? Let's double click on that. Let's go do some marketing inside. Let's go do some research. Let's go understand, is it because of our current innovation portfolio is low, right? And so on and so forth. This gives us a net of your region.
Deeper or other instruments rather than changing the initial instrument.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. I'm waiting to see if there are questions or comments. Otherwise, I'll keep on having here. Greg and I can speak anytime. So hoping that others have some ideas that are emerging from the data, or just what's interesting looking at the data set.
So I just want to show you really quickly, what I'm going to do is kind of show you what the question looks like. So how does this actually play through in terms of organizations that do this actual tool itself? So what happens is when you first create an account, there's a master account user, shall we say. That person creates the account and that becomes the data for that account itself. So that have to answer things like, where's the organization based? What is the age of it? All that kind of stuff. And then the questions come through, and it looks like this. It's really simple. It's a question. So for this one, I've seen you may not be able to read the colleagues. It says, is your company able to operationalize, implement adequately to meet your strategic plans? There's a YouTube video there which explains what does operationalize mean, because we can't assume that people know what that is. And there's 2 slides. It's where we are today, the first slider, and the second slide is where we see ourselves in the future. So that's how the data gets acquired. And then at the end of each section, there's a space for long form paragraph. Anything else you'd like to add around leadership, organizational landscape, and I'm also putting some stuff in there around disruption. So what are you working today? What do you think will be this really disruptive innovative today? And what about in the future? Which is some data that we can use later on for pieces.
That's qualitatively type something. Okay.
Yes, so colleagues, I would like to meet that very much. And sorry for the shout.
Next to be Really, I wanted you to go to your slide about the 3 landscapes. So you have the formula.
So yeah, 1 second, let's do that.
So people online are either very happy with your work and they don't have any comments, or they haven't had any.
Let's hope it's nice to deep dive a bit more.
Yeah, to ask questions or what wasn't clear, what's not convincing. Maybe you don't agree if you don't think these things can be quantified. We do tend to have a very strong qualitatively leaning school, so maybe the ones that throwing people off, but I think they've got one of the schools as well. One of the things I was wondering in terms of this, because I think this is really interesting, your explanation of the formula and how we tend one thing over another. But I wanted to kind of what, and this is what you were saying correctly about what, I mean, I would imagine why people tend to look at the orange is, I guess we tend to do the thing we feel we can control, right? And so we can spend time restructuring and doing all of this team stuff, even though maybe it's completely not aligned to what's happening in the landscape, or the real problem is the C-suite or whatever the leadership means. But are there any ways to sort of make sense of why or how the orange can be even to the, or is that what the correlations show? Like you were trying to think about, okay, fine, so maybe you think the only things you control are your overhead dynamics, you don't control the leadership, you don't control the landscape. But what is it that perhaps you might be able to bolster in the way you do the orange that helps you actually be better tuned or responsive to these things?
Yeah, so I can only give you my full, there was no study that was done on this. my personal view is the orange stuff, the running of the organization, it's easier to do. It's easier to throw money at technology. It's easier to bring in some consultants to boost our operations. It's easier to put in a system around metric measurement, right? And then we can potentially see an ROI over time. So we invest 10 million into a system, a SAP system. What's the return on that? We probably try to quantify that. It's really difficult to quantify a greater alignment with the team. Because again, how do we even measure that? What does it mean to be aligned as a team? It's one of these things where because it's sentiment based, I think that's the power, even though that's also the shortcut to WSO, right? So as an aggregate view of a team, are we very aligned? Yes or no? Well, it might mean different things to different people, but we all know what alignment is at the end of the day. So my personal view is I think leaders and corporate leaders specifically focus on the orange stuff just because it's easier, to be honest with you. One, it's easier, and also it's also a question around how do you show an ROI on this? And I think it's easier to do ROI from orange things, certainly than the blue stuff.
We're going to limit it to one extreme and one simple example. A simple one might be, for example, I may say, yes, I'm investing in culture, but that's because I think that's going to shift my team, or that's going to shift the mindsets. So yes, I appear to be saying orange, but I'm saying orange because I'm trying to affect blue. A more extreme example would be, I'm investing in tech to replace leadership altogether and have an AI governance system. So actually, I am investing in blue.
That's a great point. I mean, so I think there's a few interesting pieces behind it, right? So one thing I didn't show is culture as a metric is measured to the team. Do we have a good culture today? What good culture in the future? But you can actually break down what culture means, right? So you can actually now find what's a perceived culture, the measurement of culture, and we can probably an average weighting, an average view around cultural elements, which we things like mindset, alignment team, it would be experimentation, risk-taking, and maybe disruption. Now, we could vary also because you could say, well, we're a trucking company. Those are not the elements we want in our company. As a trucking company, we want to strip out. So it's actually a negative correlation between the trucking company and risk taking. So you can start creating a very cool model around what does culture mean for each organization based on these measurements. Once you have that, then we can say, cool, now we've got truck company culture, and now how does it correlate to other stuff? So there's actually some other research there as well.
Yeah. That's a really important point because otherwise, I guess one might be critical of it, kind of making it look like we all fit a model, but actually you can fit the model to your circumstance. Yeah. Okay, I don't know, I'm not seeing any questions, comments. People online, are there any thoughts or questions? And people in the room as well who are PhD students and are probably trying to think how can they use your methodology because it's not the right one for their project. Wouldn't it be lovely just to find detail? Anybody online? Any comments? Any questions? Otherwise, we'll probably wrap it up and open channels for people who want to engage more with Greg offline. And then is the deck going to be available? And the deck will be available, and the platform is live. So
yes, the platform is live in the sense that you can go check the survey itself.
Yes.
Obviously, I can't give you access to the data. What I can do, if there is interest, obviously, you and I can have a conversation about this as well. I'll make the PDF version link available. I can also give you a sample of the database. If you want to pay for it, we can say, as opposed to 50,000 data points, 10%, 5,000 data points. Scrub and online to say, okay, with this, if there's some interest, what do you think with that?
So if, for example, just go to your next slide that you had here. If, for example, a master's student here or at any of the school says that, okay, we'd like to play experiment, actually the next one, although this will speak to remind people. If people say, well, yeah, actually, I think this is really, really interesting and I want to ask some questions, so this might fit within the topic that I'm thinking, they would approach you, and then what would happen?
I think,
or they would approach Tarisha.
I'll say Tarisha.
Okay.
I think let's make sure that it's anchored in the right place. If you're coming to me directly, I think we start blurring the line.
Okay.
I think we should, obviously we have discussions, but we position within the Tarisha thing as a project or an angle and access to use. And part of that, frankly, is also just contractual.
Sure.
I also don't want to be in a situation where the individual researcher, master's PhD, does something and it might be a likeness for them and also for me. Right? So I think we should do it that way. I think the key piece around that point, though, Profit, is that we can pivot around 25 times 2 factors as well as demographic data and or a bundle of like the culture question. So let's assume there's a researcher listening or live or otherwise. I'm researching the role of culture for in a 4-hour world. Right? We can even go and say, well, let's craft what culture looks like as we as a just example on these 5 attributes, and compare it with a more traditional manufacturing organization or a slow-moving mining organization or some version thereof. These questions are on customer focus and so on and so forth. But the point is, it's dual purpose around many different factors.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. So I see a number of people in here are WSG people, and I guess it may take a bit of a stretch for the governance people. But I think there's good examples you've given about how it might fit to governance. I think the business school really needs to see this, and I think business science and e-sciences, and I don't know if there are any of those people in the room, I don't recognize some of the names here, but I really think that it would be really great for students to be able to see this and because they're always looking for topics and things that they want to study. And I think the fact that there's a database available and already some interesting questions emerging, I think it would be really interesting to see how people might pick up on that.
And just on that point, it forms part of the database, but this is part through my initial PhD research. Some really interesting things as well emerge out of the research. It seems like there's an inverse correlation over time between operationalizing a business and the use of technology. I.e., as we use more technology, operational excellency drops off. There's an inverse correlation. And that was that perception. But now we've got data we can do that, potentially even over a longitudinal base. Right? So some really cool stuff around that. There's questions around the weighting of leadership over time. So really important as you start up, it actually drops off in scale up and operationalizing and systems become important. Leadership becomes important again as the marketplace disrupts you and you have to disrupt the marketplace. So you need to start finding things like that over the mature period of time.
Okay, I think we can leave it at that. So we'll make the information available, and I think people can approach so if there's an interest in hearing more about this or being able to begin accessing the data. Or inviting students to do that and to play with it. As you heard, anybody can fill in the survey or just people who are relevant?
So theoretically, it's right now bound to at least 3 people from the same company. That, however, doesn't stop us from even setting a dummy company. So we can do the same thing Tarisha works. So we can say, let's set up a dummy company. As long as we have 3 respondents that are bound to the same identifier, we can actually do the survey and say, how do we view ourselves as Tarisha, even though we're disparate individuals? And maybe it's something we should do today.
Go to the School of Governance. Yeah, we go there. So thank you very much, folks who are online. Thanks to those in the room. Craig's book is available as well. But in particular, if you have an interest in this, playing with the data set or recommending it to any of your students or considering your own research, please let us know. Thank you. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you. Thank you all.